Welcome to the podcast, everyone. Mondo Gonzales here in studio with a great friend, Bill Salus. And we're going to be looking at what has been happening, certainly in the Middle East, specifically Israel. As you all know, October 7th, a war started. And one of the things that Bill did, he wrote a great article for our magazine, the February 2024 magazine, where he looked at things, at the events in 2023, and also kind of gave some information at what he thought could happen in 2024. So Bill, welcome.
Yes, exactly. And centered in the Middle East primarily. We took a look at what happened last year in 2023 and projected, well, what then could that platform and spring into in 2024.
Yeah, and what you're saying, Bill, too, is that there's so many passages of Scripture that you've been writing about and that speak about, again, these scenarios that are happening, which again could happen. Nobody's saying this will happen. But the other thing too is that when people look out and they wonder, Israel is at the center of everything, and I want to talk about that for a moment because as we get to the end of the age, God keeps Israel at the center of world events. And we know that in the tribulation, it's Jeremiah 30, verse 7, it's a time of Jacob's trouble. So let's talk about that. Why does God keep Israel centered?
Well, one of the primary reasons in the end times is God has big plans for little Israel. And we find that in Ezekiel, the prophecies of Ezekiel 38 and 39, one of the marquee events of the end times. Of course, the regathering of Israel in 1948 was sort of the start of the bookends. Israel's back in the land, fulfilling the ability to fulfill end times prophecies. That's when many of us believe was the sign of the end times clock, the hourglass turning over and the end times starting, the end times clock ticking. But what's going to happen ultimately in the Ezekiel 38 confrontation, where Russia brings forward this massive coalition with Turkey, Iran, and other countries from northern Africa and some of the breakaway Soviet Union republics, countries, to invade Israel for plunder and booty. Many of your viewers are going to be aware of that prophecy. But God's going to stop that supernaturally, not the American forces, not the Israeli Defense Forces. It's too formidable for Israel to stop. So God gets involved supernaturally. We find out with a massive earthquake. There'll be hysteria, friendly, every man's sword will be against his brother. We find flooding hailstones, flooding rains, great hailstones, fire and brimstone, etc. The world will be clear that was the God of the Bible that protected Israel against that massive invasion, because after that's all done, it says in Ezekiel 39:7, I will make my holy name known in the midst of my people Israel. They shall not profane it anymore, and the nations shall know that I'm the Lord. Now, that's not necessarily salvation knowledge. That's an awareness that the God of the Bible supernaturally protected Israel. And so he's going to put the world on official notice through that event, through Israel. My people Israel, he calls them, Ezekiel 39:7, the chosen people of the Abrahamic covenant, the unconditional Abrahamic covenant, and the Holy One in Israel, it says at the end of Ezekiel 39:7, in the promised land. So you have to have the chosen people, the Jews in the land. They got back there in 1948. They're still coming back. And the land of Israel was reinstated as the nation of Israel at that time. So those things are in place, and God's going to put the world on notice. He's the covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and the promise-keeping God of those who put their faith in Jesus Christ. And that's the primary event in the end times that he's going to do that.
Yeah, it's amazing, Bill, as we think about what God is doing here at the end of the age. And the fascinating thing about it all is that God will not allow the world to do what they want. He's going to keep Israel centered. And the fact that Israel is involved in so much of what we see of the geopolitics, it reminds people always to look at this country as well as to know that this country is in the Bible. And so it forces, in my mind, a biblical conversation. People are going to say, well, why don't these people just go away? Well, they're in the Bible. The Bible promises the land. We look at Romans 9. These are the covenants. We worship the God of Israel. Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. The United Nations, as we know, condemns Israel more than anybody else. And so when we think about this, it sets the stage for the end of the age and Israel, again, being centered. But one of the things that you did in the article was you gave an update on 2023. So why don't we start there? So kind of give us an update on what you wrote about and that happened in 2023.
Yeah, and I do want to do that. I do want to say one last thing about God working through Israel at this point in time, and why He's allowed the world leaders to run amok, and the world be such a bizarre mess that it is and chaotic at this point. He's a long-suffering God, as we know. I believe that the Ezekiel 38 prophecy, for multiple reasons, is a pre-tribulation event. I won't get into all the reasons, but one of them I believe is because God, as a loving God, wants to let the world know He's a loving God who keeps His promises and His covenants before the tribulation period. Because the Antichrist is going to come on the scene, and he's going to try to convince people to worship him. And God wants to give them the true alternative to worship God prior to that. He's going to let the world know He's the loving God of the Bible who keeps His promises. And that's why I think one of the reasons He's allowed it to get where it's at now. And He's going to force people to come back and realize, hey, listen, I'm here. I exist. I wrote the Bible. I protect Israel, etc. I'm the defender of that nation and the lover of all peoples.
Exactly. I mean, that is perfectly said, because, for example, let's take the book of Romans. And when we see the tremendous promises that are found in the book of Romans, we look at Romans 1:16, where Paul says, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. It's the power of God unto salvation, from Old Testament to New Testament, all into verse 17. And then he begins to share these rich promises of the gospel itself, that everybody's condemned in Romans 3, we're saved by faith in Romans 4, and we're justified and we are exempted from God's wrath in Romans 5:9. And so you have these rich things. Well, when you get to Romans 8, we have this big crescendo of the gospel. And Romans 8:1, there's no condemnation for those who are in Christ. You get to the end of Romans and he says, what will separate us from the love of Christ? And then the question comes up in people's mind is that, well, if that's so amazing, what about Israel? Where does Israel fit in? If the promises of God are so true, then what about Israel? And that is a great question. And it reminds us, because Paul then goes into Romans 9, 10, and 11, where he begins to answer how God has fulfilled His promises in the current age to the people of Israel. But it also brings up to the bigger picture, will God keep His promises to national Israel? Because we know that the Jewish people of the first centuries, again, the first believers were Jewish, and they were incorporated in what we know as the church. But what about national Israel? Is God going to keep His promises that we have in the Old Testament? And so we know that here we are at the end of the age, it does make that happen. And so as we think about that, let's transition a little bit to some of the players, because in 2023, Bill, I mean, again, God's keeping Israel at the center. He's going to keep His promises, but there's so many players involved. We have Hezbollah in the north, Syria in the northeast, even Jordan to the east. Egypt's kind of hanging out down in the southwest. And of course, as we know, we have Gaza. Those are the immediate neighbors. And then, of course, we have Iran and others around. So let's talk about that. And let's talk about some of the big events that happened with these players in 2023.
Well, let's start with the elephant in the room, and that's Iran. And we want to invite the viewers to stay tuned, because we're going to get into some scenarios that you and I talked about after we set the stage of what happened in the past year as we look forward into this new year, that I think are really very prophetic, dealing with multiple prophecies that seem to be aligning presently as the stage has been set in this 2023, this past year. So we certainly want you guys to stick around for that segment, because Mondo and I had some backstage conversations that were really quite interesting. Even I found them very interesting with respect to your spin on a couple of things that I was talking about. But back to 2023 with Iran. A lot of things happened with Iran. Of course, they strengthened their relationship with Hezbollah, Hamas, of course. A lot of the Hamas leaders and some of their troops trained in Iran before October 7th. We find that out from the New York Times. Even though Iran tries to deny their involvement in the massacre on October 7th, we realize otherwise. With Syria as well, they got involved with moving more and more missiles into Hezbollah's hands, into the Houthis' hands. Of course, the Houthis down below by Yemen have been using those missiles from Iran that they got in 2023 to choke off commerce on the Red Sea. Of course, the United States has gotten involved with a coalition, namely Britain, but there's some other countries too who at this point are trying to stay somewhat anonymous, some of them, to try to stop the Houthi advances. Syria, the chemical weapons. Also, they were trying to move some of the chemical weapons from Syria into Hezbollah's hands. Very dangerous because Hezbollah has continued to increase its arsenal with some precision-guided missiles, probably about 150,000 missiles pointed at Israel. So we saw that they strengthened their relationship with their proxies, but they also strengthened their relationships with Russia and Turkey and the members of Ezekiel 38, another meeting I think it was around the summer of last year with those countries. They had several prior after the conclusion of the Syrian Revolution. Those countries, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, wanted to kind of navigate through what the future of Syria would look like with respect to their interest involved in Syria as well. They got relationships they established with Saudi Arabia. China brokered a deal early in 2023. So all of a sudden Saudi Arabia is getting concerned that maybe they need to start making amends with Iran so they don't get nuked when Iran gets its nuclear program, which, by the way, since the disbanding of the JCPOA, which was put in 2015, Trump withdrew in May of 2018. We find out, I think it was in, I got it written right here, in October, we find out of last year, 2023, Iran was noted to have over 22 times the allowable amount of enriched uranium. A lot of that was up to 60% purity, which is just a stone's throw away from 90%. Matter of fact, we believe at this point Iran could literally have 3 to 5 explosion-ready nuclear weapons. They cut off inspections, I think it was September of last year, from the IAEA, so we don't really know. We don't know if they've got delivery mechanisms to deliver those. They came out and said they have a hypersonic missile last year that could reach Israel in 400 seconds and carry a nuclear warhead, and a hypersonic nuclear weapon. Hypersonic ballistic missile can travel 5 times the speed of sound. 400 seconds is 6.66 minutes. So they've strengthened these relationships even with the United Arab Emirates, UAE, who's part of the Abraham Accords. They were meeting with Iran delegations at the end of last year, trying to hedge their bets, too. Even though they're part of the Abraham Accords, we want to make sure we're still friends with Iran. Matter of fact, I'll shoot forward into the present. UAE has recently come out and said they were going to restrict the United States from using some of their bases to, attack Iranian interests because they don't want to upset Iran. That's in 2024. We're still back in 2023. So Iran has gotten, and they also strengthened their relationship with Russia. I put in the article, they were supplying Russia with lots of drones to fight in Ukraine.
I mean, that's really a good point, because when you think about the drones, what I find fascinating here is that Russia, this greatest superpower, I mean, it is a superpower, no doubt. They have really the most nuclear weapons of really anybody in the world. But yet, why is it that they're buying these drones from the country of Iran? So Iran is supplying them these drones, which shows you that Russia doesn't have the capability to at least manufacture them in their own way. And so they're going to Iran, again, the superpower is going to Iran to buy these drones. But the other thing that comes up too is, again, Israel's a very powerful military, but what people need to know is that Iran is an extremely powerful military. They have a great infrastructure. Their entire, a lot of their money is geared towards it. But at the end of the day, do we know if they have a nuke?
They could at this point. All indications are that they probably do. Do they have delivery mechanisms? We don't know that just yet. They probably also do. They also opened the Eagle 44 underground air base on the west coast of Iran, which is got, where they've got all their portable rocket launchers buried underground, underground missile silos, the hypersonic missiles. Of course, that's the closest area to Israel, where they could, and also defend themselves from Israel and anybody coming from the east, the west, going eastward toward them. Anyway, also this just came out. They've developed an unmanned surface missile, meaning they could launch it from the sea, and the Houthis have these now. Not to mention the unmanned aerial vehicles they have too, the UAVs that they can use.
Yeah, we've been hearing about these unmanned vehicles and these unmanned surface vehicles, which is pretty amazing that the Houthis have these now. And that's one of the things that's causing trouble there with, our presence, because again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to preserve the shipping. And so now you have these unmanned vehicles that are hard to find. I just heard this week or last week that they were 4 seconds away from getting a bomb on there. And so to me, that the Biden administration, they seem to be just super, super weak on this. So I guess that's a question, Bill. Why is the Biden administration, why are they looking so weak on this?
I don't think it's the Biden administration's primary objective to engage in a massive war, especially with Iran. I think, of course, they're continuing, as we see in 2024 here recently, the political track, trying to calm things down diplomatically. And they think the cure-all, of course, is a two-state solution. Get Israel to comply, give the Palestinians some territory, etc. That would help them normalize relationships with Saudi Arabia, and everything could be hunky-dory and kumbaya. There are the UK and the USA are taking some attacks on the Houthis, some of the cities in the Yemen area, Port City recently. So they are getting a little more aggressive. But you're right, the commerce, roughly about 12% of natural gas and grains and electronics and things come through that Arabian Peninsula there. And big shipping companies like BP and whatnot have stopped shipping through there. That's, of course, why we're getting involved from a commercial perspective, so that the world economies can, and especially American economy in an election year, can still do well. So I think it's more economically driven than it is protective of Israel. And we see that more and more now as the Biden administration starts seeming to put more pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu and Israel to cease fire, to stop going down deep into the Gaza, the Rafah crossing, etc. Two-state solution. Matter of fact, as we sit here today, the Biden administration is talking about putting together with the Arab states a firm plan, they say, to have a two-state solution. He's also threatening to cut back some of the military aid from the United States to Israel, and kind of trying to box in Benjamin Netanyahu, coerce him into complying, under the impression that that's going to solve all the problems.
It's interesting, Bill, because I think we're pretty intelligent, and we look around and we look at what the Biden administration is doing, and it's like they're blinded. Have they not read the charter? Do they not know, in trying to force Netanyahu or put pressure on Netanyahu to do these things and to negotiate with these people? All the billions of dollars that have gone in to the Gaza Strip, and as we know, a lot of the Hamas leaders are wealthy. They're living in Qatar and in these high rises, but yet the Biden administration forgets all this stuff. It's like they're blind. They could have used all that money to build condos and have vacations and everything else. So to me, I look at the Biden administration and I wonder if they're blinded or if they're just simply foolish.
The Biden administration only needs to look back in 2000 at the Camp David summit with Clinton, 2005 through 2007 with Bush, 2014 with John Kerry, Secretary of State with the Obama administration. Every time, even Trump tried a little bit with it too, but of course he didn't try it at the level that these other guys did. It always failed. There's no way that that's going to work, and it's not biblically endorsed. And we're going to talk in the latter segment about how militarily the end of the Arab-Israeli conflict is going to be resolved, not politically brokered. As we move forward and we talk about last year, one of the big deals last year was Hezbollah. Hezbollah started to engage shortly after the October 7th massacre with Israel. Now, they've got about 150,000 missiles, and they've literally launched several thousand since October 7th, around that time. October 10th, I think they started at Israel. But they've been predominantly, they're less advanced missiles. A lot of them have fallen indiscriminately in fields, have been taken out by the Iron Dome. They have caused some problems for Israel. They've killed some people, etc. But I'm going to read the reasons why they haven't gone full throttle yet, because I think it's a layered campaign that Iran's got going in phase 2 would involve Hezbollah throwing their firepower. Because last year, Israel prepared, May of 2022, Israel did a Chariots of Fire military drill, a big exercise preparing for a multi-front war with Iran, Hezbollah, Syria, Houthis, Shiite militias in Iraq, and they prepared for massive thousands of missiles. They said 6,000 missiles a day the first couple of days, 2,000 effective missiles in the phase 2, all kinds of casualties inside of Israel. They were preparing for that even back in May of 2022. That has not happened yet on the level that it could, that Israel was preparing for. And what has happened is Israel's got evacuees from the northern part of Israel. Roughly about 80,000 people are living in hotels now for the last 4 months. And I've got these bullet points of why I think Iran is basically allowing Hezbollah to just sort of play on a simple level, like a crosstown conflict rather than a massive engagement. Remember in 2006, the summer of 2006, a 34-day conflict, Hezbollah launched 4,000 missiles into northern Israel and kept most of the residents of northern Israel in bomb shelters for 34 days. They haven't even started on that level yet in Israel, although the evacuations, of course, have happened. And Israel, by the way, is saying they're going to have to take out Hezbollah and move them back further so that Israel can start bringing the evacuees back into their hometown.
Yeah, I mean, this is exactly right, because the Litani River is very important. And they don't want what happened in the south, where they were able to break through the wall. They went in and they attacked all the very clear and adjacent cities. Well, in the north, the Litani River, from the border of Israel, it can be as short as 2 miles. And so there's thousands and thousands, tens of thousands of people that have evacuated up there. And because if they were able to cross and get over the border, they'll have another slaughter in all these cities. So they've evacuated most of those cities. And again, they don't want a repeat of what has happened in the south.
So what I write in the article about why Hezbollah may not be involved on the level as of yet, commanded by Iran to go full throttle, I write these things. 1, the goal could be to spread the IDF thin by diverting troops and important military resources from Israel's north down into the Gaza. We're seeing that happen, although Israel is deployed strongly in the north. But they are being depleted down there. Deplete some of Israel's missile defense systems, namely the Iron Dome. And of course, if America starts cutting back on some of the aid, that's going to make it even harder.
Exactly. I think that's something that we need to mention, because what the Biden administration, again, has been doing is, again, threatening to reduce the resupply of the Iron Dome, the David Sling. They have all these other mechanisms of defense. And so if they don't get resupplied, well, they're not going to be ready for when the real Hezbollah attack comes, which, again, they'll launch tens of thousands of missiles. And when that real barrage happens, I mean, will Israel be able to keep up with the limited supplies that they have?
Right. So that's another reason. I think the other thing, too, what it is doing is creating danger and chaos and hysteria among the civilians living in northern Israel, forcing these Israelis to evacuate their homes and towns. What that does is it renders them unavailable as combatants should Hezbollah initiate a ground war with hand-to-hand and house-to-house fighting. It makes them a refugee burden on the Israeli government and society. And all tourism has currently ceased in northern Israel, devastating the economy. So it's got economic impacts as well. Also, it provides more time for the international community and the Muslim nations within it to further unite in a propaganda media war against Israel. And that's playing totally to Iran's favor at this point in time. We're seeing not only the Arab countries, but the international community as well as meddling on Israel and how they should fight in this war. And then lastly, I wrote, it also gives Iran more time to arm their hypersonic ballistic missiles with nuclear weapons that are probably already in their arsenal.
Totally agreed, Bill. And let's not move on too quick here, because one of the things that we see, again, since October 7th, is this propaganda war. And Israel's defending itself. They're going in. They're going to clean out Gaza. But what did we see? I mean, I always thought and knew that anti-Semitism was still around. But after October 7th, to see all these pro-Hamas protests in London and in Paris and all these other places, even around the United States, I was shocked that this anti-Semitism was there, and this gave it an opportunity to bubble up. And so when we think about that, as we move forward, every time every day that this goes on, Israel is losing the propaganda war, because they're going in there, they're cleaning house, and the world is against them. And so as we continue to watch this, Israel's continuing to be isolated. They're just going to continue to be isolated every day that this goes on. And we're hearing this could go on for several more months or even another year. And so in that, the isolation of Israel is continuing. The propaganda is going to continue. I mean, that really is one of the key things I see right now.
Right. And even, unfortunately, the Biden administration is contributing greatly to that propaganda war. I mean, I won't mention the words, but because of the frustration President Biden's had with Netanyahu, he's called him a blankety blank. He just can't get Benjamin Netanyahu to comply with his two-state aspiration. And what is this two-state supposed to bring? They think it'll normalize relationships with Saudi Arabia. And the Arab world. Well, that would take you back to the Arab Peace Initiative, which is the prerequisite for any relationships with Saudi Arabia. And that involves several things. One is give back land for peace, land that Israel acquired in 1967, and also as if Saudi Arabia, they said, well, what you'll get in return, Israel, give us land and peace for a Palestinian state. What you'll get in return is the Arab countries will start to normalize relationships with you, as if Saudi Arabia can control all the Muslim hatred throughout all those nations. They've got no guarantee that they can offer that.
Exactly. I don't think there's any way that Saudi Arabia is going to convince Hamas to change their charters and to change this hatred. I mean, their very existence, their very identity is geared towards removing Israel from the river to the sea. They can't ever change that. If they ever do, their entire identity will be misplaced. And I mean, Israel learned a lot from 2005, leaving there. Now, what do you have? You have 400 kilometers worth of tunnels all through the Gaza Strip, and some of them are going into Egypt. And I mean, that really is an amazing thing to see, that some of them are going into Egypt, and which means a lot of material and contraband are coming from the Egyptian area. And so will they be able to convince, Saudi Arabia or even these other, if we had this new accords, would they be able to convince the Palestinians? I don't think so.
Yeah, and you mentioned Egypt. I want to spin there in a moment. But like you're saying, you cannot convince all the Muslims who hate Israel to be their friends overnight. The 45-year anniversary of the Iranian Revolution in 1979 was recently celebrated in a parade with chants to death to America and death to Israel. I mean, you don't change that disposition in that region over there. It's an ancient hatred that goes back from time immemorial that is now embraced in a religion of violence called Islam. Egypt and Jordan, right after October 7th, shortly thereafter, both of those countries who have fragile peace treaties with Israel sided with Hamas. Basically, it's the occupation of Israel, they call it, that is the real culprit and the real problem. And now that we see that Israel is moving its way down, and by the way, both countries, let me start with this one. Now that Israel is moving down into the Rafah crossing, the Rafah take the battle down there, where a lot of those Palestinians have had to leave parts of northern Gaza to move down there. There's over 1 million people now in that area huddled down there. The Biden administration, everybody's going, don't go in there, have a ceasefire, etc. Egypt, meanwhile, has said they built high walls. They got 40 tanks there. They're going to have. They're saying, okay, don't let these refugees come into our country. We're going to put them in an internment type camp. We're not going to call it a refugee camp because that's more permanent. But the moment they start coming in and infiltrating our country, the peace treaty that we have with Israel could be suspended. And Jordan is saying the same thing. We do not want them in our country as well. So these Palestinians are being forced into exile. Mm-hmm. They got nowhere to go. And so now the burden becomes Israel's burden, and Israel can't, they're fighting some kind of a sanitary war that the world's trying to dictate. Israel can't do that.
For the most part, Israel does not want to annex these places. I mean, this is well known. I mean, again, when I was studying modern Israel, I always ask, my professor, well, why doesn't Israel just take over? And he says they don't want to because they are built on a democracy, which means that if these other areas A, B, and C, for example, the West Bank, there's a lot of Muslims that live there. And if they go in there and annex, they have to give them citizenship, which means then they get a right to vote. And then they're going to vote, and it's going to change the nature of the Knesset, the parliament in Israel. And eventually, just by sheer numbers of birth, it will become a majority vote. The majority of the voters will become Islamic. And so they could just simply vote out a new constitution or whatever else. So Israel does not want to annex these places. And I mean, that really is one of the main challenges as we watch this is, will they maintain sovereignty? They have to maintain sovereignty. And we see that, again, even in the West Bank area, even though the Palestinian Authority has main authority there, Israel still reserves the right to go in there with the army and to, again, to bring control or to police these areas if necessary.
Yeah, and so back to the relationship with America and Israel. Of course, many people are very supportive of Israel within this country, but back to the Biden administration in general. But one of the hits on initially when Benjamin Netanyahu became the prime minister at the end of 2022 was that he didn't get invited to the White House. I think it was around September he came over to America, still didn't meet in the White House to my knowledge. I think he met at the United Nations at the 78th meeting, or 78th, whatever they call it. So it was a slap there. And then, of course, after that, we have October. And now we got so initially America understood that they were wrong. The massacre was absolutely terrible. So we supported it. But all of a sudden now that whole tide is shifting toward trying to control the situation. And of course, in an election year, a big carrot on the Biden stick would be if I could put together a two-state solution. Yeah. And he's going full throttle in that direction. So I see very grave concerns for this country if we're going to continue pressuring Israel in that direction.